Left of the line, they sent me up after the burn because I had steady hands and didn't mind quiet. That was what the foreman said on the phone, like quiet was a resource we used up and ordered by the pallet. I told him I could run water-finding transects and set erosion wattles and take pictures that looked like the same picture taken 100 yards apart. He said, "Good, we've got grant money and timelines and not enough boots." I packed my truck with my usual kit, flagging tape, orange and pink, the handheld GPS that chewed AA batteries like sunflower seeds, a coil of measuring tape, stakes, a hammer, sample jars, a cooler that had once been red, a milk crate full of folders. I always bring extra pens, though I end up writing with golf pencils I find in the truck's door pocket. The town had a good name if you were writing it on a report, Haycross. It sat where the highway shouldered up against the ridge, far enough from the river to be spared the worst of the flash flood, when the ash sloughed in, close enough to the canyon that every breeze carried that scorched smell you get on a skillet left too long on a burner. 2 summers back, the fire had run hot, jumped a spur, crowned in lodgepole, rolled through the slash piles like those were built for it. Folks said lightning took it, the kind that makes you feel like it hit you because the light arrives inside your head before you hear the crack. I came the first week of September. Daytime highs still pushed 80. Nights dipped enough to make the motel blankets feel like a decision. The Blue Sink District, the name for that chunk of forest on my assignment sheet, was still under a closure order, except for agency staff and contract workers with badges. I stopped at the Forest Service office in Haycross before heading up. The fluorescent bulbs in that place buzzed like they were chewing ice. The woman at the counter, Renee, slid me my temporary badge through the slit in the plexiglass like I might drop it, or she might. She had a jar of coffee creamer on her desk. It was labeled sugar in black marker. Either she was out of sugar or past caring what folks thought of a jar. "We're keeping it light on outreach," she said, tapping a laminated sheet of the closure notice. "You'll still see folks up there, hunters usually. It's like they smell a rule and want to test if it's real. I'll stick to the burn polygons. You got a radio?" "I've got my phone. There's a window at the switchback if you stand on the guardrail and salute. It's how they trained me." She smiled without showing teeth. "Just mark what you can. The reports don't read themselves. There's no such thing as a clean burn. You think fire clears, but it only changes the list of what's left and what wants to try next." The map showed my work area like a stain soaking the ridge. The truth of it was a suture of logging roads, berms, and places where ravines had widened from sudden brown water. The first day I parked at the junction of Form 42 and an unnumbered spur choked with charred straw. I tightened my laces the way I always do. Heel slams into the ground, toe flex, tug the loops, double knot, and said out loud, "Okay, Nora, left and right today." It's a thing I do. The left side of a hill is never the same as the right. Road runs the crown, but the water chooses a side. I wanted to see how the hillside let go. The ground had that give-you-get on fresh burns. The top inch was ash that looked like it should float, and under that was something that was both damp and unwilling. I laid down my first transect from the road to a snarl of blackened root wad. Pink flag at the top, pink at the bottom, orange at 20 meters. I took 3 photographs from my knees so it wouldn't feel like I was judging, and wrote Transect 01. Moderate loss of duff. Moderate. Some hydrophobic sheen. I licked my finger and touched the bare dirt. The water beaded like on a new jacket. I put that in the notes because it was the kind of detail that read big. On the way up the second transect, I passed a stump that had burned like a chimney. The inside was a column, the bark a shell, and the core had burned up from the roots like breath drawn the wrong direction. I'd seen that before, but it still made the skin on my neck tighten. Power's funny when it chooses a path that you can see after it's gone. I swung the tape around it and heard a little murmuring sound I wrote off as a weed, being a reed, being a whistle. I looked up to see what the wind was doing. The trees, what was left, had that lacquered shine like they were wet, but they weren't. "That's the resin," the foreman told me once. "Heat cooks it toward the surface and it catches the light like a lie." A jay landed on a limb and watched me. Its head was wrong, or the limb was wrong, or my sense of proportion was still catching up to the new landscape. Its eyes sat a touch too far forward, which made it look like it was judging me harder. It jerked its head in steps, not smooth like birds usually do, more like a child practicing what a bird looks like. I said hello as I worked the tape under a log. It didn't fly away. When I stood, it made 3 quick chips without opening its beak. The sound came from down in its throat like coughs stitched into chirps. I told myself it was ash. I told myself birds were coping like the rest of us. I marked 11 transects that day and quit when my phone told me it was 6, like it had a steak in the evening. Back at the motel, the ice machine on my floor made a sound at the top of every hour. It wasn't a grind or a dump. It was a single clack, like a spoon set gently on a dish. I held still in my doorway the first time I heard it. Then I laughed at myself and tried the sink. The water came brown for 3 seconds, then cleared to a transparency so eager it looked insincere. The motel put a flyer in each room the week I arrived that said, "Due to post-burn hydrology changes, you may experience temporary discoloration." The letterhead had an eagle that looked surprised by its own job. There's a hum in every refrigerator. The one in this room landed in a note that made my back teeth ache if I paid attention. Some folks sleep to that kind of thing. I kept thinking it might be saying a word. I opened the door and the light didn't come on. The hum did not change. I stood with my hand on the handle until the ice maker upstairs clicked at the hour again and I closed it. The second day I worked the ravine that slashed east of the road. There was still that smell like a skillet that someone had poured water on. It's not sharp. It's round and persistent, a low tone of the nose. I wove around deadfall and marked 2 gullies starting to right themselves downhill. At the 3rd gully, I saw boot prints sliding toe first, then stopping. I looked up. The closure sign was zip-tied to a burnt sapling. The letters bubbled from heat. I listened. It takes time to learn what silence in a burned forest means. It's not the absence of sound. It's sound that has fewer places to land and bounce back to you. I could hear the power lines on the ridge as a whisper. I could hear insects scouting. I could hear a chip of bark fall like it was significant. I heard a voice too, but it was the kind of voice that is wind wrapped around a mouth of a hollow and slung back at you like it cares. It said low and stretched like the words had a weight on them. Left of the line, left of the left, left again. I do not spook easy, but it put a hand on the middle of my back and pressed. I went left, because that's what the map said you should do to find the head of a gully, which is where you stop the story if you can. I placed straw wattles like I was setting out an old man's pillows. You can do it neat, or you can do it fast. But if you do it neat, you'll only do it once. I wrote the coordinates on a popsicle stick and tucked it under the netting so I could find it again. The GPS blinked like it was squinting. It does that when it does not like the sky it has. At noon, I walked back to the truck and listened to static on the weather band because it is a habit. The voice came thin and over-enunciated. Red flag warning until 2200 hours. Avoid operations with spark potential. Secure loose combustibles. The no burn sign on the office whiteboard in town would flip to no with the magnet. The check cashing place near the diner would tape a note on the door about fireworks being illegal. I made a sandwich from a loaf of bread I kept in the cooler. The bread had picked up just enough of the ice smell that it tasted like the inside of a chest. I worked until 4, then stopped early to drive down and buy more hay bales. The hardware store in Haycross was the kind where you can buy a bolt by holding the one in your hand and pointing, while the man behind the counter nods like he is bringing you a memory. They had wattles piled against a wall. When the clerk rolled them to the register, he scanned the barcode. And the scanner beeped in a tone that matched the refrigerator back at the motel. It made the back of my teeth ache again. The display said, Wattle 20 FT straw, $34.99. He gave me a receipt that had a smear down one edge, like it had been printed on onion juice. He asked if I needed twine. I said I had twine for miles. He asked if I was the one who'd been marking the 442 ravine. Word gets around, even if all you do is stick flags in the ground. Just mark it, he said, like the words were a joke. I mean it the other way. You'll mark it, and then it will mark you. After he said that, he rubbed his hand over his face and said, Sorry. We had a guy try to use the post-pounder on a juniper the other day. He got himself a ride. It's been a fire season. He nodded. He printed a second copy of the receipt like an apology. That night, the ice machine clicked at the top of each hour. The refrigerator hummed itself into that tone it liked. I lay on the bed and watched the red light on the smoke detector blink at a steady pace. I counted the blinks. I counted the seconds between the ice machine, S click, and the smoke detector, DS blink, and convinced myself I was finding a pattern. That's fine. Patterns are how folks like me keep from feeling like the world is a place where things happen for no reason. I do this kind of counting until I fall asleep. I woke at 3 to the sound of my truck alarm chirping once like it was clearing its throat. I went to the window and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. The parking lot held its shadows. A man in a camo cap stood at the edge of the lot smoking, his face lit every time he dragged. He was looking up toward the ridge like it held his TV. He flicked the butt into a coffee cup and went inside. Day 3. I stepped over a fence that used to keep cows out of the timber and clicked the GPS to wake. The screen flashed 00 at me, like it thought I didn't just know where I was or when it was. It did that sometimes right after you put new batteries in. It would take a minute to find itself again. I laid a transect, the narrow-leaved green sprout that comes up first in a burn, fireweed mostly, had started its hopeful thin. It should have made me feel the thing you're supposed to feel when you see that. Instead, I kept hearing that not a voice say, left of the line. I turned left more than I should have. The transect ended not where the water wanted to go, but where something else would have gone if you told it it could. I wrote, deviated to check slope character. That's a phrase I use when I want to admit I followed a burr of an idea. A deer watched me from a black snag. Its ears twitched the wrong way when flies landed. They did not shiver them off. They pivoted in chunks, like ears made of stiff felt, adjusted by a stagehand offstage. Its eyes looked wet, and then too wet. I took a step nearer, and it did not choose me or the space away from me. It made a short, sharp stamp, and the sound was muffled by the ash. Behind it, the ridgeline looked 90% the same as all ridgelines do, and 10% like it was a ribcage for something that had decided it wanted a spine again. You can rationalize anything if you give yourself enough rope. I told myself the deer were eating wrong because the grasses were wrong, because the seed bank was wrong, because the fire had not burned right. I wrote in the margin of my book, Ungulates display altered flight initiation distances, because I learned a long time ago that if you write it that way, it feels like a thing you can hand someone and they'll nod. That afternoon I ran into hunters, 2 men and a boy. The men had the lit look you see when they weren't not hunting meat, but a time with each other that they hope is how stories grow. The boy had a Coke. He tipped it to me like it was a hat. One of the men had a fishhook scar at the corner of his mouth that pulled one side of his smile into a notch. You're not supposed to be here, I said, and then softened it with, I mean, the area's closed. The notchman held up a piece of paper in a plastic sleeve. We got the special, he said. 4 predators. He said it the way you say a word you want to hurt the ground with. The boy looked not at me, but at the wattles rolled in the back of my truck like they might be a kind of animal. He said, do you lay them in lines or circles? Lines, I said. He thought about that. His Coke fizzed up the straw once like someone tapped the can. "We'll be off the roads," the other man said, which was his way of telling me that the law to them was a polite suggestion. I said, "Good luck," and their boots made that crunch grind of ash under tread. When their voices faded, the understory does what it does in a burn. It holds the sound of people and releases it back in pieces if the wind asks. I found a pocket of green that day. It was low and damp, the kind of place that takes fire like a suggestion. It had been spared. The trees there were whole but glossed with heat. Dead needles made skirts. Something had come through and rubbed up against 6 of the trunks at exactly the same height. The bark wore a smear that looked like it had packed dirt into it wet and then set hard. My first thought was elk. My second thought was not an animal I could name. I measured. It was 57 inches from the ground on all 6. I wrote that down. I took photographs that refused to capture the sameness. When I got back to the truck, I found 3 small stones balanced on my tailgate latch. 2 quartz, one a kind of slick river thing that had no business on a ridge. I looked around. The edges of the clear cuts were either too open or too closed. No just right in those transitions. I walked to the road and looked for boot prints. There were plenty. None of them seemed to care about the rear of my truck. I took the stones and placed them one by one on the dash, like they'd come with a purchase. The motel's hallway stank of something caught in a tooth. The ice machine clicked. The refrigerator in my room had drifted into a tone that matched the barcode beeps from the store. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the smoke detector blink. When you have choices, you can spread them out on a table and push them around with your fingertip and pretend you re-choosing. When you don't, you organize your day by small rituals that feel like choices. I lined up my pencils. I stacked the field forms by date with the latest on top. I ate a hard-boiled egg I'd forgotten I had packed on day 1. The yolk crumbled like old newsprint. On day 4, Renee at the office slid me a new closure map with the border shifted 3 miles closer to town. "They want to widen the no-go," she said. "Came down from state, people were hearing things." Hearing things like what? Nothing we'd put on a paper. Nothing you could cite. How many complaints makes a closure shift? "We're not doing democracy. We're doing optics." She tapped the map where the new polygon marched into the private timberland. Also, someone fell. They said roots. They said the ground grabbed. Grabbed? My word, not theirs. I thought of the sample jars I had in the cooler. I thought of the way the ground had held my boot for a second on day 2, like a hand that wanted to be sure. I nodded like maps were just shapes. The afternoon gave me more of the same, with just enough more to feel like it was different. I laid down wattles where the gullies widened their mouths. I flagged a slope so steep that the flagging tape hung straight down from the branch, a lesson to the wind. On the 5th placement, I nailed a stake through the netting, and the stake hit a root. That's nothing. That's every day. I lifted it and tried 2 inches left. Hit it again. I tried 2 inches forward. This time the stake pulled itself sideways as I swung. The wood felt alive under the mallet. The head of the stake chewed off in splinters. I said, "Hey," to nothing, in the firm voice that works on dogs. I tried again with my foot braced a different way. The stake angled, then straightened like something under the ground had decided it would allow it after all. I cut my losses and wrote, "Anchorage adequate." On the walk back to the truck, I passed a patch where the fire had eaten all the duff and licked the minerals clean. It felt like walking across a dish someone hated. A whisper came around me, the way those dry gullies whisper when they were thinking about how there used to be streams. It made the hairs on my neck rise in rows. The whisper said, "Stay on the line, or you'll be the line." I stopped and turned in a slow circle because it felt like turning quick would be rude. I blamed it on wind and the lip of the ravine, the way air trips on edges. I don't tell stories about voices. If I write it down, I'm obligated to make it true, and I'm not paid for that kind of truth. The hardware store clerk asked me, when I bought more straw that evening, if I'd noticed the owls. "They are out during the day now," he said. Voice dropped a notch, so the other man at the paint mixer wouldn't hear. "Eyes are like marbles. Stare too long at one and you'll forget what time it is." "I haven't seen them," I said. "You'll see them, or they'll see you, and that counts." He slid the wattles over the scanner. The beep hit that note and carried it. My receipt printed with a blank line where the item name should have been. It read $34.99. He stared at it and tore it off and handed it to me anyway. Back at the motel, there was a notice stuck with blue tape on every door. It had the county seal and the same surprised eagle, only smaller. "Boil water advisory, until further notice." The lobby switchboard woman said, "We'll bring you bottled." She handed me 4 little bottles with threads in the plastic like they'd been twisted one too many times. The ice machine clicked at the hour. I held my plastic bottle up to the light and watched bubbles climb the inside like a rope they could take all night if they wanted to. I slept 2 hours at a time. In between, I lay there and catalogued the noises. The fridge hum. The highway a quarter-mile away like a soft hand rubbing on grit. The upstairs guest's footsteps steady to the bathroom, irregular back. At 2:38 I woke to a different sound. It was the sound you get when you're re-walking a gravel drive in low light and you step on a patch that rolls under. I got up and looked through the curtain. The parking lot had not rearranged itself, but the ornamental tree by the walkway was tilted. It had not been tilted earlier. Its mulch ring looked scuffed, like something had spun around it one notch. There is a point, when the world doesn't behave right, where you either put it in a box and stack it with the other boxes, or you take the lid off and put your head in. I stacked it. I slept eventually. I know better than to go to church just because week 5 lands on a Sunday, but I did anyway. I sat in the back. The pastor talked about rebuilding, which is a word that fits into a lot of mouths. He said ash makes good soil if you mix it right. He said the Lord works with what we have left. The ceiling fans in that place ticked like clocks if clocks had no numbers and cared only about moving air. After the service, the woman with the jar of creamer, Renee, patted my arm and asked if I'd had any trouble with my boots. I told her they were still boots. She nodded like that was a good answer. On the walk back to my truck, I passed the bulletin board outside the Grange Hall. Lost dog signs had been layered and peeled and layered again. The newest had a dog looking over its shoulder in the picture the way dogs do when you call them from behind. It had been printed at home and the ink had run a little. The tear-off tabs had the owner's number. 3 had been taken. 3 tabs torn off is a good number for the heart. Not none, not all. Someone believes. Under the dog sign was a notice. Siren test, Wednesday, noon. I stood there and pictured the siren spinning and lifting the hair on my arms, and decided I would be up on the ridge when it happened, so I wouldn't have to feel it on my chest. The next morning I checked in at the office, moved a magnet on a board from field to field east, and drove up 442 until the closure sign told me I'd gone far enough. The roadside was wet with dew that made the ash stick like talc. I parked at the switchback where the map said a feeder drawer came down. 2 days prior I'd noted a slough there that wanted to learn a new shape. I grabbed the wattles, the stakes, the mallet, the tape. It is a nice thing to have work that says, carry the thing to the place, set the thing down, make the place, and the thing shake hands, walk away. The drawer was steeper than my memory made it. A fallen trunk had burned into a gnarl that looked like a hand the size of a stove curled in a fist. I said, we aren't doing that. To it, because sometimes putting a name on a shape you don't like steals its play. I angled the first wattle across the mouth of the drawer. I set 3 stakes. The ground gave and shifted. I set the next wattle below to catch what the first didn't. I tied the twine like I learned in a CPR class. Loops easy to release in a hurry. The third wattle resisted. The stake slid in, then met something that felt like muscle. I pulled it up and the ground pulled back like taffy. My heart did its small animal act. I swore softly, which is my way of reminding myself I own my body. The stake came free with a wet sound that had no water in it. The hole it left slumped a little. The smell that came up made me think of pennies and sap. When you are alone, small decisions carry larger weight. I could have moved the wattle 6 inches and likely missed whatever lived down there. I pushed it 2 inches and tried again. The stake punched through. I felt its seat. I heard a low noise as from under a stage, like someone dragging burlap. I said, "We are almost done," because finishing keeps trouble on the other side of the door. I backed away, brushing ash from my knees with quick, embarrassed slaps. The drawer murmured. I turned to face downhill and my left boot sank a 1/4 inch. Roots sat just beneath the skin of the slope, and they moved. Not wriggling, not striking. The way you see under the skin of a forearm when a tendon slides. They shifted in one direction, then stopped like they'd forgotten what they were doing. I pulled my foot up slow. The ash made a little vacated hole, like the breath out of a bottle. In that hole, the dust had finer dust. I put my foot down on rock. I told myself it was settling. The weather band on the truck told me a line of dry storms was marching. The voice listed the towns alphabetically. Haycross came late. I pictured lightning raking the ridge again and thought of the way power chooses its path. I thought of the smear on 6 tree trunks, all exactly the same height. I thought of the hunters with their laminated special. I thought of Renee tapping a map just above a river bar where the arm of the closure had bent. On day 6, I took a soil core in the green pocket. It's good to have numbers. Numbers don't argue. The core came up with a coil of root wound around it in a neat spool. I pinched the root and it pulsed, not with blood, but with something like a slow, even exhale. Plants move. They do. You can put a camera on a bean and make a time-lapse and watch it lean across a gap like a dog across a ditch. You can watch a sunflower track the sun and feel like the world keeps a schedule. This pulsing wasn't a time-lapse thing sped up to make you feel clever. It was in time with my breath if my breath were deeper and older and believed itself. I put the core in the jar with the lid loose because you don't want to trap living things that want air, even if they are plants. The glass fogged for 1 second like it had sighed. I told myself I had done it. I screwed the lid and wrote, "Sample 06 GNP, organic matter high." At the motel, the ice machine clicked at the top of the hour. The refrigerator hummed itself into that note. I turned the fridge off. The hum went on. It was not the fridge. I unplugged the lamp as if lamps had motors. The hum went on. I pressed my ear to the wall. Under my ear, the drywall felt warm, which made no sense. Dying sun in the hall. Heat from the man in the next room irritated at my logic. I moved my ear to the top corner. The hum dimmed there. I moved it to the floor. Stronger. I lay on the carpet and put my palms flat. It felt like the building had a pulse. The next morning, the ice machine didn't click. I stood in the hallway, waiting for a sound ID moaned about, and when it didn't come, I felt like the day had slid to the side. In the office, Renee asked me if I had any plan to go higher on the ridge, toward the old fire break. "They want eyes," she said. "The folks in the last row of houses are hearing things. Siren test today. Noon." I drove up. The light on the ridge was white without being warm. I parked where the road leveled into a clearing. The maps still called the staging area. The grass there had come back in an even nap, like the might of the state likes even naps. The white siren on its pole down in town sent the noon test up the canyon. The sound took its time arriving. It wasn't a single note. Sirens never are. They are a throat finding the perfect grind and holding it. The pines, black and glossy and grim with crowns still in tatters, took the sound and sent some back on the wind's slow hand. I had the feeling you get when you re on a ladder and your foot slips a rung, and for that half second, before it catches, your body knows more about itself than it should. On the slope beyond the staging area, I found a lattice of new willow shoots growing from the creek's buried line. A culvert had been plugged with furniture, and that the word for it, because once the fire jump-started the flood, And the flood took the back porches, and the back porches went where water makes choices. The county had shoveled and scraped and set a bigger pipe. Willow doesn't care about infrastructure. It grows where the water remembers. I bent to tie a flag around the tallest shoot and heard a whisper, not like wind in grass or breath through a hole in your front teeth when you'd re-ate. This was clearer. It said, "Mark me as yours, so I can mark you back." I'm not superstitious. I carry a rabbit's foot only as a keychain because the keys need something to keep them together. But I did set down my pencil and my book and slide the rabbit's foot into the pocket of my vest where I keep the pencil. The fur was worn, where my thumb runs over it sometimes when I am in a meeting waiting my turn to talk. I stood there with an open hand. The willow leaned a degree. I chalked it up to the breeze. I wrote, "Willow, good vigor. Channel insists on old path." Somewhere in the trek between one flag and another, one wattle and another, one day's hum and the next, the world had made a new rule set and had not posted it where I could read. I'm not saying the rules were different in a large way. A list of what was in front of me would be trees, charred, slope, steep, rocks, inconvenient, air carrying smoke from a prescribed burn over the ridge, birds available. It was the way these things behaved together that had changed. I could feel a schedule that did not match mine. The ice machine had stopped clicking. The siren hit noon and made a loop in my chest. The refrigerator hummed the same, whether it was plugged in or not. The aisles at the hardware store smelled like hoses. Hoses have a smell like a new doll's head. Every time I breathed through my mouth, I tasted pennies and something green that aligns with the back corners of your sinuses and nudges you toward the door. Rene asked for photos. The foreman emailed, "We need day stamps." I told him I'd set the camera to imprint them in the lower right. He wrote, "Make sure you get the stake in the frame." He wrote, "We got sign-off for more wattles." He wrote, "The report will want a section on anomalies." He wrote, "Do not speculate." I wrote, "Understood." Then I wrote a thing and deleted it and wrote, "Understood." Again, like echoing myself would nail the boards. The hunter's boy waved at me on day 7. His coke was gone. His mouth had a ring around it like he'd put it on a bottle and crushed the foam up between his upper lip and nose. He did not seem put out by it. "We heard owls," he said. "They sound like people calling down a long hall." "You gentlemen staying off the drawers?" He looked at the men. They nodded at him, which is how that works. He said, "We were up by a place with new willow." He looked at his hands like they were a fact he had to remember. "There was hair on a rock. We couldn't agree if it was from an elk or a person, even though we know better." He stood there with that line on his upper lip. It looked like ink. "Where's your laminated special?" I said. One of the men patted his pocket. The other one put his hands in his vest, like he was trying to keep things from falling out of him before his next thought. "We'll be clear by dark," he said. "You could be clear now." "Not how we do it," he said, and he had that something in his voice that made me want to take his meaning and walk it into the trees and leave it there. They went. The boy turned around once and made the smallest hoot your throat can make when it is dry. That evening, the motel's vending machine, which had been out of service since I rolled into town, breathed to life with a sound like a chest deciding to try again. It blinked A1, A2, B1 in red LED. It put a dot after each number when I pressed the button, like it wanted to tell me it was thinking. I watched the coil holding one of the candy bars shiver. Then the candy bar did not fall. The coil spun back. You do not have to be 13 to feel this as a personal insult. I walked away because I did not want to stand there and be a person arguing with the machine about what it owed me. A storm marched at night. Lightning stitched the ridge. The power in the motel went out at 1:13. The refrigerator kept humming. The hallway filled with a blue emergency light that makes human skin look like a receipt left in a jacket pocket washed by accident. The tap coughed my toothbrush out of my mouth with a spurt of brown. Pipes clanged like thin bells. I heard a woman in a nearby room sob, once then clamp down. The emergency light hummed too. The hum swelled when the storm walked off. Outside the ornamental tree by the walkway tilted another notch. It had nothing to lean on. It leaned anyway. I dreamed that the Ridge S roots had pulled themselves into braids and were laying those braids across the highway, like ladies laying their hair over a back of a chair, and the semis coming around the bend had to choose to run over or not run at all. I woke with my hand on my own hair, which was damp and smelled like the Motel S shampoo, with the label that said rain and nothing else. It felt like my hair had tried to leave and the world had put it back on my head. You can do 3 kinds of work after a burn. You can count what died. You can count what lived. You can try to keep water from choosing a faster way down. I had been doing the 3rd. On day 8, I did the 1st, because the foreman asked for a mortality plot in the green pocket. I laid out my square. I counted trunks above a diameter and noted how many had entirely scorched crowns. I tapped my pencil at each trunk like a metronome when I called out the numbers to the recorder, which was me. I usually don't talk to myself in a math voice. I did that day. 15. Scorch class 3, 9, Scorch class 2, 17, Scorch class 4. The pencil felt like a little baton keeping the air in order. At the 5th trunk, a hole opened at my feet like something had sighed and forgotten to pull its stomach back in. I did not step back. I am not brave. I was slow. There is a place in the brain where we put delays. We pretend we don't make them. I put a delay there. In that delay, I saw roots crossing each other and recoiling when they touched, not out of harm, but like people uncomfortable in a too crowded hallway. I saw a small skull with the back of it polished and the front of it burned. I stepped back then, and the ground let me go. When I stood on firmer ground and put weight in my heels, the slope made a sound like a big animal clearing its throat. "Okay," I said. "I'm not here to take." It felt foolish. It felt like a thing you say when you want a space to understand you were not its enemy. I filled the hole with ash with my boot. I smoothed it the way you smooth a bed after you get up. I wrote nothing about this in my notebook. I drew a little box and left it empty. That is not a lie. That is a pause. At the motel, the ice machine had been unplugged. Its click was gone for good. The fridge in my room hummed all the same, but if I set my hand on the door and pushed it open slowly, the pitch would glide 1 note down, then snap back up when the gasket made that little fart. I did it 4 times. On the 5th, the hum adopted the lower note like it had been told it could. I let go of the door. The lower note stayed. I felt like I had won a game I had not agreed to play. On day 9, I went to the old fire break. The bulldozers had churned through there when the fire was still the kind you could say hello to without it deciding to climb into your mouth. The break ran along the ridge, with a view of a swathe of country that made it feel like the earth had been brushed one direction for once. I marked where water had gnawed channels across the break. Those would run the first rains. In the ash flats between the channels, new growth had sprouted in strict lines. I bent down and realized they followed the tracks of the dozer. Seeds had ridden whatever metal pressed that day, and now they were making a diagram of a machine. I took a photograph and felt like maybe I had stolen something. I turned back toward the truck because hunger tells me where trucks are, even when I think I can keep walking. That was when I saw him. Not a person. Not an animal. The size of a man crouched or a bear upright. Its back bowed like it resented the angle. Its head hung and then lifted in jerks like it was learning the word up. It stood in the thin shade of a snag, and I had to tell myself it was a snag because my body wanted to make it a mouth. I put my hand on my vest where the rabbit's foot sat. The fur caught the grain of my nail. The figure shifted left. Every bird in that clearing kept singing. That bothered me more than if they'd gone silent. Sometimes quiet is the kind of laugh you hear from the wrong room. I looked down to see where my next step would be. When I looked up, the thing was not where it had been. The snag looked ordinary. The light was baseball white. My throat made a sound that might have been my name if I were calling myself from a long way off. I ate, sitting on my tailgate, bread this time without the cooler smell, because I'd left the door open. The receiver for the weather band made a hissing like a fist rubbed on denim. I picked at a splinter in my palm until a clear thread came out that might have been pine sap and might have been me. My phone buzzed. A text from a number that was just numbers. Stay left of the line. I typed, "Who is this?" The reply came before I hit send. "You're already left of it." My stomach did its long drop. I set the phone face down. I looked at the road. Nobody. The only tracks were mine and the ones from the hunter's truck. I turned the phone over, took a photograph of the message, and deleted it. I did not like that I did that. I liked more the feeling that the thing had been moved from one box to another, from something that could change into something that had been captured by pixels. Later in the office, I could pretend I had not taken that picture. The boil water advisory lifted and then unlifted with a robocall that used my name and pronounced it like an apology. I boiled anyway, because once you start, you keep doing it until something bigger than you says not to. The vending machine ate my dollar with less ceremony. The motel woman at the switchboard told me the tree by the walkway had been planted when her mother was pregnant with her. "It leans this time of year," she said, then looked at me like she'd told a joke and wanted to see if I was the type to laugh. Through all this, the work continued. Wattles placed in a line that made sense for water flags hung not only so I could find them, but so others later would look at a slope and see where we had tried. The act of tying flagging tape becomes a prayer if you let your fingers go without thinking. They find a loop, they slide the knot down, they make it tight enough to stay but loose enough not to strangle the branch. I realized on day 12 that I was making the same knot every time, even though I think of myself as a person who varies. The knot looked like a small shoulder leaning into a load. On day 13, the clerk at the hardware store had a bandage on his shin that had bled through in a circle. He scanned my wattles and said, "You ever hear something in the culverts? Like a person with a cough, but not standing where a person could stand? Air does that," I said. "It drags its feet on the screws." "This was like laughing," he said. And then he did the thing where you say a word and immediately don't like that you put it in the room. He lowered his head and bagged my twine like he was ashamed for the twine. "They chose me for this work," I told myself, "because I do not make trouble larger than it already is." My form of caution is not avoidance. It is going forward with eyes and writing down what I see in words that make sense later for someone who was not here. Even so, my breath had gone tight. Nights were short. Food lost texture. I was eating to make silence. The radio in the truck would static, then pull a word through the cloth. Advisory, anomaly, afar. The root in the jar I'd taken pulsed less as the days went by. Then one morning, the fog on the inside of the glass was shaped like the whirl of a fingerprint. I put my thumb up to it. For a second, it matched. I told myself this was coincidence. Intention is a kind of glue. I decided to drive to the line where another district began. Borders exist for reasons more political than physical, but it felt like crossing would give me some kind of proof that the air would not follow me. The southern line took me past a sign where a ranger had tacked up a new closure warning. The tack had gone in crooked. It made the sign list. I do not like unearned listing in objects. I pulled over and straightened the tack. The sign made a small, relieved click. That's the kind of click I like. I got back in the truck, and a beetle on my windshield began walking from left to right. It paused wherever my eyes landed, then moved when I looked away. When it reached the right edge, it did not drop. It walked past the rubber and into the air, and was gone. On day 15, I followed the ridge fire break further than I had intended. One wattle, then a second, then a third. A minor hell of swings with the mallet, the twine biting skin, the ash becoming a glove around my calves. The daylight thinned not into dusk, but into a kind of high haze that makes every shadow back off a few feet, so you believe there is more room than there is. I told myself I would set one more and turn back. I have said this many times in my life to my own legs. I set the stake against the edge of the wattle. The ground shifted like a sleeping thing, acknowledging a touch without waking. I swung. The stake slid in like it had been waiting for this exact diameter and angle. I felt that damper in my chest that says, you got away with something and the world let you. I looked up. Across the break, a line of young trees had grown into each other the way rows of corn will braid if you plant them too close. Their branches touched and then interlocked. Each junction looked a little like fingers. I do not like writing that. It reads like a woman's magazine horror story. It was true all the same. The joints were not human fingers. They were wood doing what wood does when it finds the shortest distance between 2 points happens to be through. Behind that interlocked wall, something moved. I could not see it. I felt it move, the way you feel someone step into a room you are in, behind you, and you can't hear them but the air reports. I took a step, and the ash held me. I took another, and the ash released. At the third, a root looped over the top of my boot. I looked down and breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, like a person trying to get a blood pressure cuff to read the truth. The loop was a root, and it was not. Its fibers had the look of wood that had once been a vine and had learned rigidity late. It was not moving fast. It did not have to. You could say wind moved it. You could say my foot had come to be in the place it was because gravity cannot be argued with, and you would not be entirely wrong. But the root had that slow flex like a hand's first opening after sleep. It did not pull. It laid itself more over me and more, as if it wanted to learn my shape. I eased my foot back, and the loop eased with it. I thought of the boy in the camo hat, making a small hoot like an owl with a dry throat. I thought of the note from the knotter number telling me where the line was. I thought of all the times we draw lines on paper, and then the land teaches us that the only line is the one the closest root draws between its point and the next. I said, I'm done, in a voice so level I didn't believe it was mine. I shifted my weight. Another root came over my other boot, slow and considered. You can get yourself killed in woods lashed together by rot and gravity, by moving fast at the wrong time. That's a phrase we use, lashed together. It implies intention where there is only physics, but physics is the polite name for a lot of the world's intentions. And if you are not careful with that fact, you end up being the kind of person who tries to treat 6 tons of slope like a chair. I did not move. The root laid on me like a blanket pulled up to a collarbone. It was not heavy. That made it worse. The hum that had chased me from motels and vending machines and refrigerators found me in the open air. It was not in my ears. It was laid gently on my back teeth. It was an A, maybe, pitched against a G that made us sweet. That sweetness is how hymns get written in buildings where the boards show daylight between them. I didn't like that thought, so I packaged it in a box and stacked it near the rest. Okay, I said, left of the line. I had moved left without meaning to. I had followed water logic when something else had been writing. The root tested how firm my ankles were and pressed just enough to be an answer. That's when I did panic. Not big, not a mouth-open run. The kind of quick that starts in the stomach and tries to stampede your knees. I fought it. I reached for my knife. Not because I thought cutting would work, but because hands find old tools when they want to believe they make choices. My fingers closed on the handle. My thumb knew where the notch in the wood was. That was enough to make the panic look for another host. I held still. The root loosened like it had shifted its attention. A word ran through my head that I do not use and will not put on this page. The sky made the switch toward evening without changing its tone. The birds did not go quiet. They held the noise the way a distant freeway holds noise. After a minute or an hour, the kind of measure that makes fools of clocks, the root slid off my boot, as smooth as hair slipping from cloth. I stepped back and left the stake in the mallet and made the slow move toward the break. I did not turn my back on it. That is a superstition. It is also a thing you do when you respect something that has just told you the new rules. At the truck, my hands shook. They made the keys do that little song against each other that keys make. I sat on the bumper and laughed once at the same joke that did not exist the day before. I texted the foreman, heading down, TMRW install more at 442 draw. What time you want photos? He texted back. Morning. He did not add a period, he never does. The word looked like a mouth drawing in air. When I got to the motel, the ice machine was outside on a dolly. The hallway smelled like classic car upholstery. The woman at the switchboard asked me if I'd had a good day. I told her I had had one. She nodded like she knew lists and did not mind them. The refrigerator in my room hummed from across the hall, where the man with the camo cap had propped his door open. I could see into his space. A TV showing a man smiling too wide, a cooler with a sticker of a fish, boots leaned together like old men in a cafe. At the threshold he had laid a strip of duct tape sticky side up, as if he wanted to know if something crossed into his room while he slept. The thought made me stand there longer than I should have. He appeared at his door and saw me seeing it. He held up his hand. It was a good hand, wide across the knuckles, workers' lines. He didn't smile. He said, "They're cutting the siren to once a week, worry fatigue." "They do that?" "They do a lot," he said. "You laying those straw snakes for them?" "Yes." "They holding, for now." "Good," he said, and that was the end of our talk. I slept 4 hours, then woke. Sometimes in the middle of a thing, you get to choose the next door. Sometimes the choice is the thing. I got up and sat at the little table with the chair that wobbled. Because one leg had been shortened a fraction by some night's angry shove, and I wrote what the foreman would need. I wrote specifics. I wrote dates. I wrote numbers. I wrote none of the things I have written here. This page is for me. That page was for the report. Near dawn, lights came on in the hallway while the rest of the motel stayed dark. This happened on its own. The lights hummed. The hum found my teeth. When the sun finally made enough light to turn the window into a square with shade in it, I put my boots back on. Laces, heel strikes, double knot. I opened the door. The duct tape across the camo man's threshold had pine needles stuck to it. A smear of something dark had been dragged from outside to in, thin as a hair and twice as troubling. His door was open far enough for me to see the TV, which was static. Static is not white. It is 100 colors each, telling you why it should be the only one you see. The man's cooler sat in the same place. His boots had fallen away from each other. The room smelled not like car upholstery. It smelled like wet soil brought inside and told to sit. I did not go in. There are lines. Even now, even then. 2 days later, the closure moved again. Renee tapped a new map. Her nails were cut short. She wore a ring that looked plain and expensive, as if it had had a life before this hand. "Down to just the break," she said. "They want to call it good." "It isn't good," I said. She shrugged in a way that meant, "Neither are we, but we will make it pass." "They also want to rejigger the language on behaviors," she said. "Nothing about hearing, nothing about things being different, strictly visual, physical. We still putting in wattles, until the grant turns back into a pumpkin," she said. The day I went back to the place where the root had laid its hand on my boot, I brought extra stakes. It felt like showing respect. I set them in a line every 6 feet, not because that's the manual, but because that rhythm felt right in my bones. Each time I lifted the mallet, I felt a pause just before it fell, like someone was touching my wrist and saying, "Wait." The creek below the break talked the way creeks do when they have to convince themselves they have a job. I worked until I got to the wattle I had left. The stake I'd given up on lay to one side. It had sprouted a white nub the size of a grain of rice. Not my wood, not any wood I knew. I picked it up and put it back down. I cut the twine and rewrapped it. I tightened the net. I did not cut the white nub. It was one nub, a single syllable of a word I did not want to hear spoken aloud, while I bent and tied and swung the mallet and left one more orange flag on a bare stick above the line. I felt watched. And I do not mean by the kind of watch that sunsets do or hills do, or the way a map on a table does when the people around it are talking about where it begins and ends. I mean the kind where your body holds still so that if anything in the world moves, you will know exactly where it is. The deer with the two wet eyes moved in my peripheral. The owl, upright at noon, turned its head a fraction and made a low sound like a man saying "uh-huh" and not agreeing. The wall of interlocked branches did not move, but was not still either. The way a sleeping person's breathing does not count as motion when you look a second too long. The root came again, not under my boot this time, but over the top of the wattle like it had learned the word across. I placed my hand on it. The bark was new, and because it was new, soft. It was not warm. That fact made it worse. Warm would have made it animal, cool made it intent. It reached toward another root, and they met in a touch that was neither collision nor overlap. They lay there like two cords, letting the same finger press them both. I pulled my hand back. I drove a stake on either side and tied the net tighter, not to hold them in, but to mark them where my kind can read. On the way down the ridge, the siren did not sound. Noon arrived and was quiet. People get nervous when the clock doesn't do what it's done before, even if what it did before was make them nervous. The wind shifted and ash from a slope across the valley lifted and crossed at the height where smoke shows you the secret ways air moves. I pulled over behind a logging truck because the driver had stopped and stepped out with his cap in his hands. He looked up and said, "They say it's getting better. My wife sleeps again." He looked like a man who did not want to know if I had a second opinion. "It will green," I said. "Green is good." "Green is something," I said. "That's right," he said, and he put his cap back on like his skull had been cold for a minute. That night, the refrigerator finally shut up. I had to tune myself for a minute to notice what I was not hearing. I lay there with the silence in my teeth and tried not to count between smoke detector blinks and vending machine knot clicks. I slept without dream. When I woke, something of me felt missing, and I could not say which part. It was not a hurt or a hole. It was more like a drawer being moved to a different room. On my last day, on the day the grant money turned into a pumpkin and the spreadsheet reached its last cell, I went up not to set a wattle or flag. I went to say something that didn't belong on a form. The wall of interlocked branches on the ridge was still there, and now two of the knuckles had pushed a little further into each other and had grown the beginning of a seam. This is how wood becomes more wood. I know this. I've held fence posts in my hands that were one tree embracing another tree with a ditch between that had long since decided distance was a story two people tell when they do not want to do the work. None of that helped me like it that day. I stood at the edge. I said, I marked where I could. The wind made a sound like a breath drawn in by a crowd when the communion cup slips. The roots at my feet shifted. They did not reach. They lay across my boots, as if we were measured and even. I did not panic. I did not move. I let them learn my weight. It felt in the exact place where my bootlaces crossed and under the bones of my toes and at my heel and along the long tendon that helps a foot hold the ground on a slope. Like the ridge had decided it would know me. A whispered thing ran along the network. It carried no words. If it had, I would not write them because putting a word on a thing that had chosen not to use words is a kind of theft. The message, such as it was, made my stomach loosen in a way that sorrow sometimes does when it gets a rest. The ice machine would click for the people who came after me. The siren would go back to noon. It always does. The hardware clerk would replace the bandage on his shin with a better one that didn't bleed through. The man with the camo cap would come back for his boots, or he would not, and either way, someone would eventually clean his room and throw away the duct tape. The willow shoots at the creek would learn which way humans wanted the water to go this time and get on with the business of ignoring it. The new trees would grow into each other, and someone would point and say, "Look, grotesque," which says more about us than about wood. I could leave that day. I had a back seat full of empty sample jars and a cooler that still smelled like a chest and a left shin with a bruise the shape of a wattle steak S-head. The closure map would go in the recycling, and the magnets on Renee's board would be reset to a new set of tasks printed by a machine that hummed at a pitch that suited it. The spreadsheet would be locked for posterity, and someone else would open a fresh one with the same cells and different labels. The ridge would be there or be a different shape, and it would not, strictly speaking, care. The roots laid across my boots settled. There was nothing dramatic. No pull, no slip, no sinking that you could measure with a yardstick. And a photograph later with a red circle drawn. They just learned me. The hum found me in a way that felt like a word placed on a tongue that doesn't know it yet but will. I took a breath, and it matched. The breath was not mine in the sense we like to call things ours. It belongs to the place where ash remembers heat and decides the next thing is green, whether it wants to be or not. Left of the line, left of the left, left again. Maybe that's all we ever did, make a mark so the thing could find us. I had thought I wasn't being asked to choose. Turns out the choosing had been happening since the first flag I tied bowed to a wind that didn't know me yet. I said, okay. I said it at a volume that worked for me and for wood and for all the small creatures that still had nerves enough to flinch when a woman spoke in their clearing. When I stepped, the roots stepped with me. I did not trip, I did not fall. I walked toward the wall whose joints had learned the shape of fingers without ever needing to end in a nail. And when I reached it, the seam shifted a fraction, the way a crowd makes room when a latecomer approaches the pew. I did not push, I did not ask. The branches touched my shoulder and my hip, and the small bones at the base of my spine as if measuring. A bird said something like a laugh. Far down the canyon, a siren tested noon on a day that was not noon. I thought about how green is not good. Green is just something, and something is better than a list on a board with a magnet that keeps changing. If you are expecting a section where I say I vanished, where the motel woman looked for me and only found my keys and a rabbit's foot, where Renee smoothed a map and slid the magnets and frowned, and then put a ringed hand up to her mouth and said, "Oh, then you have read too many stories where the person telling it wants a neat edge. This is not neat." I turned sideways and the wall took me an inch. It held. I forgot the hum. I remembered the hum. I kept moving. A root lifted itself to avoid scuffing my ankle bone and laid itself elsewhere. My foot learned the shape, the weight I had been carrying, a weight no one pays you for and no one named when they hired me, because it sits in the questions between what died and what lived, and what you can keep from going quickly somewhere it already meant to go. This weight changed shape. I cannot say it got heavier or less. It fit better. That is the word that does not belong on a report. Fit. On the other side, it wasn't another side. It was more of this side, only with the standing idea that it mattered less what I wrote and more what I could hold. There was space. There was room to kneel and tie a knot. There was a place to set a stake and feel nothing underneath but willingness. I made no noise that mattered. The birds kept at it. The day kept its dull nickel the whole way, and then when it slid toward evening for real, the light made every char come up into a grey, with a soft along its edge, like the ash had decided all along to settle on the place where it would hold. That night, if you want to call it night, though time had stopped arranging itself for me in a way that made the word stick, I lay my back against a trunk that had not burned through. Its bark pressed a pattern into my coat. The owls spoke like men far away, calling down a long hallway. I listened and did not move. Somewhere below, near the place where the creek insists on its old path, the willows shifted. The hardware clerk would shut the lights and put a rag over a can of paint. Renee would turn the turnstile of the porch light off and then on again, because sometimes that makes a hum go away. The motel's ice machine would either be gone or it wouldn't. The duct tape would gather more needles and then be rolled up by a woman wearing gloves who never once knew it had collected anything. The boy with the coke would hoot once in his sleep, and his father, S-Mouth, would climb around the scar and find a line for his day. I marked where I could. You can read that how you like. The ridge read it as a hand held open. The root at my ankle matched my breath, because that is the best way to understand weight. When the hum returned, it did not find my teeth. It found the place where the laces on my boots crossed and tucked itself there until it and I could tell which of us owned the next step. That was good enough for me, as it had been for years. Only this time the ground, without moving, moved me into a place where I could say it without a pen in my hand. It rained in a week. The wattles held some and let some through. They were not built to win, only to argue the water into tiring. Down in town, the siren tested noon on the new schedule, and some folks started letting their hands fall away from their chest at last. The closure shrank to the fire break, and then to the gully heads, and then was rescinded to applause. That was not applause, but the sound of boots moving gravel in a parking lot after a meeting. Someone took a photograph of the ridge from the very spot I had stood on the day of the first transect, and posted it by the coffee pot with a caption that used the word resilience. The foreclosure notices accumulated on the Grange board then stayed the same for a long time, like an old song. The willow shoots along the creek pushed out catkins that caught at the sleeves of the first graders on a field trip who had been told not to touch and did anyway, and then pretended they had been pushed by the wind. I do not know what the forest was before the burn. I do not know what it is now, because naming is always behind the thing it wants to fix. I know this. When I close my eyes and count, I hear the ice machine click sometimes, and sometimes I hear the absence of the click, and both tell me where I am. I still tie knots in flagging tape in my sleep. My hands know 2 loops and a slide. My heel knows how to set without bruising. If I place my palm on a tabletop and hold still, there is a hum. It is not the refrigerator. It is not the vending machine. It is not the lamp. It is not the power lines. It is the same note you get when you lay a stake against willingness and do not hammer until the breath underneath tells you it can take it. If you came here looking for what, no. If you came here with a laminated special and a boy with a coke and a hope you can call it predator and solve it, no. If you want to say it was the fire, you're not wrong. The burn woke anything it can wake. If you want to say it always was, and now you see it because the resin in the bark came to the surface and made it catch the light, also not wrong. Leave it at that. The choice you get is not whether the ridge learns your weight. It is whether you keep pretending it doesn't too while you stand where it can take it from you one slow, careful inch at a time. So here it is. I marked where I could. I put flags where the water would argue. I set straw where we prefer. We could pretend we can hold a slope like a song. I did not cut the white nub. It is something else's job to be neat. My job is to count and tie and be honest about when I don't know. There are days now when the smell of pennies and sap finds me in a grocery store aisle next to hoses, and the barcode beeps land on the back of my teeth, and I want very badly to be where the hum matches the place my bootlaces cross. More often than not, I go out into whatever small patch of grass the parking lot hasn't insisted on, and I stand, and I breathe, and I wait until it does. Then I go back to the list. Then I do the next thing. Then I tie the next knot. Then I mark the line, left of the left, and let the ground return the favor. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.